public image of Robert Plant has long been wrapped in mythology: golden hair, a voice that seemed to defy physics, and a stage presence that could command entire stadiums. But behind that image is a far more complicated story, one that began not in excess but in quiet resistance. Before the fame, before the music changed his life, there was a young man trying to understand where he belonged and realizing early on that it wasn't where others expected him to be. Plant was born into a structured, disciplined household in England where stability was not just valued, it was expected. His father worked within a rigid system, and that mindset extended into family life. Success meant predictability, education, a profession, and a life that followed a clear path. Music, especially the kind that Plant loved, didn't fit into that framework. It wasn't just discouraged, it was seen as unrealistic. From an early age, however, Plant felt pulled in a different direction. While school demanded focus, his attention drifted toward sound, specifically the raw, emotional pull of American blues. Artists like Elvis Presley and Muddy Waters didn't just entertain him, they spoke to something deeper. Their voices carried weight, urgency, and truth. Compared to that, classrooms felt distant and restrictive. Trying to balance both worlds didn't last long. Plant made an effort to meet expectations, but the disconnect grew stronger over time. Eventually, it became clear that he couldn't pursue music halfway, something had to give. At just 17, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He walked away from school and soon after from home as well. This wasn't rebellion for the sake of it. It was a difficult, practical choice. His parents made it clear that if he pursued music, he would do so without their support. That moment created a distance that went beyond physical separation. It introduced him to a reality he would face repeatedly throughout his life, that following a personal truth often comes at a cost. Alone and without a safety net, Plant entered a world with no guarantees. He moved between small bands, struggled financially, and lived day to day. There was no clear path forward, only persistence and belief. But those early years shaped something essential in him. They taught him resilience and, more importantly, how to continue without certainty. By the time music began opening doors, Plant was no longer naive about success. He understood instability. He understood loss even in small forms, and that awareness stayed with him even as opportunities grew. When the chance came to join what would become Led Zeppelin, it didn't arrive in the way people often assume. Plant wasn't the first choice. Jimmy Page had initially considered other vocalists with stronger reputations. Plant entered the picture through recommendation, not pursuit. It was a turning point, but also a reminder of how fragile opportunity can be. Even as the band rose to global fame, that early awareness never fully disappeared. On stage, Plant became larger than life. Off stage, he carried the quiet understanding that everything he had gained could just as easily be taken away. And in time, it would be. By the early 1970s, Robert Plant had stepped into a world that few artists ever truly experience. With Led Zeppelin rising at an extraordinary pace, success came not gradually but all at once. Concert halls turned into arenas, and arenas into massive gatherings that felt closer to cultural events than simple performances. Their music was no longer just being heard, it was shaping the sound of an entire era. From the outside, it looked like an unstoppable ascent, a life defined by momentum and control. But success at that level often creates its own kind of pressure. The expectations were relentless and the pace left little room for reflection. Touring schedules were intense and the demand for new music never slowed. For Plant, who had already experienced instability early in life, this new environment brought a different kind of tension. Instead of wondering whether he would succeed, the question became how long it could last. That underlying uncertainty never fully disappeared, even at the height of global fame. In 1970, that fragile sense of control was abruptly challenged. After a tour in England, Plant was involved in a serious car accident. The crash itself was violent, but what followed was even more unsettling. While his physical injuries healed over time, something less visible remained. He began to experience memory loss, gaps that he could not fill, moments that existed in reality but not in his mind. It wasn't just forgetting details, entire experiences had been erased. This kind of loss is difficult to measure, but its impact is profound. Memory shapes identity, and without it, the past becomes uncertain. For Plant, this meant living with a disconnect between what he knew had happened and what he could actually recall. Years later, during legal scrutiny around the creation of Stairway to Heaven, he explained that he simply did not remember certain events people were asking about. It wasn't avoidance, it was absence. Despite this, the band continued forward. There was no extended pause, no public breakdown. The expectation was to keep moving, and that's exactly what happened. Performances resumed, recordings continued, and to audiences, nothing seemed out of place. But internally, something had shifted. Plant had learned that survival didn't necessarily mean restoration. You could keep going and still carry something unresolved. As the decade progressed, the scale of Led Zeppelin's success only grew. Albums sold in massive numbers, and their influence expanded beyond music into culture itself. Plant's voice became one of the defining sounds of the time, recognizable, powerful, and emotionally charged. On stage, he appeared confident and untouchable, fully inhabiting the role that the world had assigned to him. Offstage, however, life was beginning to take on a different shape. Plant had built a family, creating a space that felt separate from the chaos of touring. It offered a sense of grounding, something steady in contrast to the constant motion of his career. For a time, it seemed like balance might actually be possible, that he could exist in both worlds without losing himself in either. That sense of stability was tested again in 1975 during a holiday in Greece. While traveling with his family, Plant was involved in another devastating car accident, this time far more severe. The vehicle left the road and crashed, leaving everyone inside injured. The situation was critical and help did not arrive immediately. In those moments, the distance between life and loss felt dangerously thin. The physical consequences were significant. Plant suffered multiple fractures, particularly to his leg, injuries that would take a long time to heal. Recovery was slow, and for someone whose life had always involved movement, the sudden stillness was difficult to accept. Performing, traveling, even simple independence, all of it was temporarily taken away. What followed was not just physical rehabilitation but a deeper psychological adjustment. Being forced into immobility changes perspective. It removes distraction and replaces it with time to think, to reflect, and sometimes to confront realities that are easier to avoid when life is moving quickly. For Plant, this period brought a sense of vulnerability that success had previously kept at a distance. Yet even in that state, the work continued. When the band recorded Presence, Plant contributed his vocals while still recovering, unable to fully stand but unwilling to step away. The album carried a different tone, more restrained, more intense in a quieter way. It reflected not just the band's sound but the circumstances surrounding its creation. This period marked a shift in how Plant experienced his own career. Music was no longer just expression or ambition, it became something closer to endurance. Continuing wasn't about maintaining status, it was about holding on to identity in the face of disruption. Each performance, each recording carried more weight than before. The illusion of control, which had already been shaken once, now felt even more fragile. Plant had faced two major accidents within a relatively short span of time, each one altering his life in ways that couldn't be undone. The pattern was becoming clear. Success could rise quickly, but stability could disappear just as fast. As he gradually returned to physical strength, there was a sense that the worst might be behind him. The band was still intact, the audience still present, and the possibility of moving forward remained. But what lay ahead would challenge him in a way that neither fame nor physical injury ever could. Because the next loss would not affect his body or his memory, it would strike at the center of his life, in a way that no amount of resilience could prepare him for. The late 1970s should have marked another chapter of stability for Robert Plant. After years of turbulence, injury, and recovery, he had begun to rebuild both his personal life and his place within Led Zeppelin. The band was still powerful, still influential, and still capable of commanding global attention. But beneath that surface, there was a quiet sense that things were no longer as certain as they once seemed. When the band returned to touring in 1977, it wasn't with the same ease that had once defined them. There were delays, health concerns, and a growing awareness that time had changed both the music landscape and the people within it. For Plant, performing was no longer just about energy, it required effort, discipline, and recovery. Still, he stepped back into that world, carrying both expectation and responsibility. Then came the phone call that altered everything. While on tour in the United States, Plant received news that his young son Karak had fallen seriously ill back in England. At first, it seemed manageable, something temporary, something that would pass. But within a short span of time, the situation escalated beyond anything he could have anticipated. A second call followed, and with it, a reality that no parent is prepared to face. Karak had died. He was only 5 years old. There are moments in life that divide everything into before and after. For Plant, this was one of them. The distance between stages, audiences, and applause suddenly felt meaningless. None of it could reach where he now stood emotionally. The tour stopped immediately. There was no discussion, no hesitation, everything simply ended. Returning home did not bring clarity, it brought silence. Grief, especially of that depth, does not arrive in a single form. It shifts, it lingers, it reshapes everything around it. For Plant, it created a profound disconnection, not only from music but from the identity he had built over the years. The idea of returning to the stage felt distant, almost irrelevant. In the months that followed, he questioned whether he should continue at all. Music had defined his life, but now it seemed small in comparison to what had been lost. He considered stepping away completely, choosing a quieter path that would keep him closer to what remained of his family. During this time, the structure that had once held Led Zeppelin together began to feel uncertain. Without Plant's commitment, the future of the band itself was unclear. It wasn't just a professional pause, it was an existential one. One person, however, remained a steady presence: John Bonham. Bonham wasn't just a bandmate, he was a lifelong friend, someone who understood Plant beyond the public image. In a period defined by isolation, Bonham offered something simple but essential: connection. He didn't try to solve the grief, he reminded Plant that it could exist alongside creation. That idea, fragile as it was, began to take hold. Plant eventually returned to music not because the pain had lessened but because he found a way to carry it differently. When Led Zeppelin recorded in Through the Outdoor, the tone was noticeably more introspective. It reflected not just a band evolving but individuals changed by experience. One song in particular, All My Love, became deeply personal. Written in memory of Kerouac, it was not an attempt to explain loss but to acknowledge it. The lyrics carried restraint, a quiet emotional weight that stood apart from the band's earlier work. For listeners, it was a beautiful piece of music. For Plant, it was something else entirely, a way to speak without needing resolution. Even as the band moved forward, the past remained present. Success continued, but it no longer held the same meaning. Applause, recognition, and influence all existed, but they were no longer central. Something fundamental had shifted. Then in 1980, another loss arrived. John Bonham died suddenly, bringing an immediate and final end to Led Zeppelin. The band chose not to continue without him, closing a chapter that had defined an era of music. For Plant, this was more than the end of a group. It was the loss of a friend, a collaborator, and a link to his own past. With Bonham gone, another piece of his life had disappeared, reinforcing a pattern that had followed him for years: connection followed by absence. What remained was not the mythology often associated with rock legends. It was something quieter, more grounded, a life shaped not just by success but by endurance. In the decades that followed, Plant continued to create music but on his own terms. He moved away from the expectations of the past, exploring new sounds, new collaborations, and new ways of expressing himself. The urgency of fame had been replaced by something more reflective. Now, at 76, his story is not defined by excess or spectacle. It is defined by continuity, by the decision to keep going even when the reasons for doing so have changed. His life offers a perspective that often goes unspoken in stories of fame: that achievement does not protect against loss and recognition does not erase pain. The two can exist side by side, shaping a person in ways that are rarely visible from the outside. So the question remains open even now. Did music save him, giving him a way to carry what could not be resolved? Or did it demand sacrifices that no amount of success could justify? The answer, like much of Plant's life, is not simple. It exists somewhere in between, where survival is not about victory but about continuing forward one step at a time.